Merhaba, ben veteriner hekim Tezcan Çak Ekmekçi. Türkiye Jockey Kulübü'nde veteriner hekim olarak görev yapmaktayım. Bugün burada Karacabey Pansiyon Hara'da bulunmaktayız. Geçtiğimiz yıllarda özellikle atçılık sektörünü çok yakından ilgilendiren EHV dediğimiz yani Equine Herpes virüs hakkında yurt dışından misafir ettiğimiz Prof.Dr. Osterreder bizimleydi. Güzel bir seminer gerçekleştirdik ve profesörümüz konuyla ilgili sorularımızı yanıtladı. Şimdi söz meslektaşım Güneş Hoca'da.
Welcome to our stud farm. We want to know you more, and can you please tell us about you and yourself and your studies?
Okay, so I was born and raised in Germany. I went to school in veterinary school in Germany, specifically to veterinary school in Munich, where I also worked initially before I moved in Germany to the Federal Research Institute for Virus Diseases of Animals. Then I moved in the early 2000s, I moved to Cornell University in the United States. Then back to Germany, to Berlin in 2007. And then in 2020, I moved to Hong Kong to become the Dean of the Veterinary School in Hong Kong, where I left at the end of last year. And currently I'm doing a sabbatical stay at Kansas State University in the United States again.
Today we are here for the herpes virus infections around the world, where is a big trouble for the horse owners and the other people. Can you tell us about some things about them as an opening?
So equine herpes viruses, there's not just one equine herpes virus, and there's a total of 9. But I would say the most important for stud farms and for the equine industry is probably equine herpes virus type 1. This virus causes mild, usually upper respiratory tract infections and disease, abortions, and what we call EHM, equine herpes virus myeloencephalopathy. So these three disease complexes are the most devastating for horse owners.
And how often do we see the herpes virus infections throughout the horse populations?
So we need to know that probably all horses that we see here or anywhere else in the world harbor this virus. It has the capacity to infect and then go what we call latent. So it stays dormant without causing any problems in the horse, and then it can reactivate caused by stress, for example, and then the virus spreads to other horses. So it is very common, but outbreaks are relatively rare. But if they do occur, abortion outbreaks or EHM outbreaks, then it's getting really bad.
Yes. And how can you tell us that how does this, when you say spread, how does this virus spread?
The virus spreads directly from horse to horse. It usually requires very close contact. But it can also spread by people, for example. If you touch an infected horse and then go to another horse, it can transmit the infection.
What about the stuffs that we use at the barns or other things?
The same. So we call this, like with persons, we call this fomite transmission. So with jointly used equipment, buckets, trenches and so on, it can be transmitted.
And after the infections, how long does the virus stay outside the body, for example, in the sand?
It depends a little bit on the temperature and exposure to sunlight. If you have exposure to sunlight, the virus doesn't like that very much, so it's inactivated fairly quickly. But if it's cold and you don't have sunlight or are indoors, the virus can stay infectious for up to a month.
Can the horses without the symptoms could be carriers of the disease?
Yes, as I said before, most horses carry the virus, have it latently. But even if it's not latent, even if it is an open infection, you must not necessarily see the replication of the virus. So even actively infected horses can transmit, and that's usually how it gets into a facility.
When we are detecting this disease, which tests or things that we use for the detection?
I think that the most reliable really is nasal swabs. And then what you always should do, not test just once, but consecutively over a few days, especially if you have an open outbreak, because you need to identify the ones that really actively replicate the virus, and usually we do qPCR these days, so nucleic acid detection.
Okay, and if after we have a positive PCR result, how many days should we should wait?
That is a very good question. If you have an ongoing outbreak, so the rule of thumb is to really, after your last positive PCR result, you should really wait for another 3 to 4 days before you can consider yourself free. And you should do your first or your last PCR testing no sooner than about 4 weeks after the first detected case. So it's complicated because the virus is shed intermittently, so you need to be a little careful and usually err on the side of caution. Just wait a little longer.
And for the treatment, what can you say? Can we do the treatment, or what should we do for the treatment?
Treatment is very difficult. There's no real causative treatment. All you can do is help the horse get over the EHM, the neurological crisis, or when you have abortion, it's too late anyways. So I think the only reasonable way to protect against the disease is vaccination.
Vaccination. And again, for the treatments, I want to ask you about, is there any antiviral drugs that you can suggest for treatment?
The research and the science on using antivirals is very controversial. Mostly tested were acyclovir or orally administrable acyclovir versions, valacyclovir, but their worth and whether they work or not is really highly controversial. So I think they don't do much. So I would always go for vaccination. Don't wait until you have it.
To treatments. What about the vaccines? Most of the people in Turkey thinks that after vaccination horses do the abortions. Do you think that they cause the abortions? And how we must use the vaccines?
There is no evidence whatsoever that any of the marketed and licensed vaccines, I don't really know what's licensed in Turkey, but there's no reports that vaccination would induce abortion. That's just, I think, an urban myth. So we should not pay too much attention to that. Always be observing, and if something happens, report and record it. But there's no evidence that vaccines cause abortions.
Okay, during the disease outbreak, how early can we do vaccination to the foals?
To the foals?
Yes, for example.
I always say you should do testing. You should go and test the foals, what the antibody levels are, for example, and make your start of the vaccination dependent on the drop of the antibodies in the foal, and just have the right window where they are low enough so the vaccine will still work, but not too low so that you are susceptible to infection. So this is a very critical time, and it's hard to find the right time, but as a rule of thumb, about 4 months after birth. Also,
I want to know about that. If there is an infection and the whole mare is unvaccinated and she is sick, should we do the vaccination or wait for it?
Don't ever vaccinate a sick horse. And likely it's too late anyways.
What should we do to stop the transmission and spread of the disease of the
It is very important that if you have a closed facility, that you only take in horses that are free of the virus, and you do this by testing and quarantining. Once you have identified the virus is in a certain area, in a certain group of horses, isolate those so that they don't have contact. You also have to really take care of the personnel to instruct them that the infected group is taken care of last in their work order. So it's a combination of hygiene, testing and vaccination, and that's how we usually keep the numbers down and keep the spread down.
And can we ever say that a facility is 100% free of the disease?
No.
No, we cannot say that.
Very simple answer, no. You can never, and you should never be sure, because you should always have your guards up, your eyes open, and do testing. Sporadic testing, and you can do, stochastic testing, but you should always be alert.
Okay. Thank you for your answers. And is there anything you want to add for the?
No, not really. Thank you. It was a pleasure.
And for the last thing, is there any advice that you want to give to Turkish owners, veterinarians, or people in the sector that are working? Any advice from you about herpes?
Yeah, in terms of equine herpes virus type 1, I think what we have learned is to always be observing and alert. And 2, if you really want to take care of the infection and the spread of the infection, follow the same rules that you follow here. Good hygiene, change clothes, and also vaccinate horses. That's how you keep the virus from causing disease.
Okay, thank you very much.